Welcome to Alamein to Zem Zem, Keith Douglas's powerful account of his experiences in World War II. This book isn't just about battles, it's a deeply personal story of what it's like to live and fight in a world torn apart by war. With vivid descriptions and honest reflections, Douglas takes us from the Battle of Alamein across North Africa, sharing moments of chaos, courage, and humanity. This is more than a war memoir, it's a journey into the heart of what it means to be a soldier. If you enjoy this type of content, please consider subscribing. These are his words. Let's begin. We were out of battle for 4 days, resting and doing all the small jobs that have to be done as soon as a regiment comes out of action, even after so short a time as 24 hours. A crusader, for instance, had run over some wire in the dark, and in the morning we found some 40 yards of rusty Danet spikes and coils wound round the sprocket between the track and the side of the tank. This wire took 2 days to remove, although it was probably collected in about 2 minutes. The light metal mudguard had to come off, the track itself had to be broken, and the sprocket had to be slowly turned over, in short bursts of 2 or 3 turns, for hour after hour, while a gang of fitters hauled at the wire, cutting it off with wire cutters as it came away. Everyone's fingers were lacerated, and under those conditions, it was certain that at least half of these scratches and cuts would turn into desert sores, messy and painful wounds that are hard to heal even when you can keep them clean. Several officers and men who had been slightly wounded in the first actions came back to us while we were resting. A squadron began to look like a squadron again, although the promised new tanks did not come. Edward and Tom arrived together in a jeep, Tom with his filthy pipe and rakish air of being in the know, common to many people who live among horses, Edward full of polite pleasure at finding me back, overwhelming me with inquiries about myself, and answering my descriptions with incredulous exclamations. Really? No. Did you? How perfectly terrific, and so on, exactly as if he was still at a garden party, where presumably he learned this kind of repartee. He cleverly seemed to ignore what was said to him, having, I suppose, evolved this protective barrage of small talk against effusive acquaintances at home. For Edward is what is called, in our current idiom, a social type. Unfortunately, this inability to pay attention hampers him in action, where he often sits in his tank with the earphones on and does not hear what is said to him at critical moments. That fault was one I had still to discover. Before I left the regiment to do camouflage work, 8 months before, Edward had already begun to lean upon Tom in most matters of squadron government. Tom had the silver tongue often attributed to a good horse dealer. For him, Blarney had long been a science, and when we were all second lieutenants, Tom was already talking others into dependence on him, while the rest of us were conscientiously calling everybody sir and keeping notebooks in which we recorded the size of our men's feet. Tom had very soon learned the names, nicknames, and history of all the men in the squadron who were popular and influential in the men's or non-commissioned officers' messes. He had sold horses to the colonel before the war, so he was not in the position of an ordinary second lieutenant, the little boy who has to be seen and not heard. All this would probably have made us dislike him out of jealousy. But he was never sycophantic, and he took a pride, as he once told me, in knowing the right way to talk to everyone, so as, in his phrase, to get them eating out of his hand. Even so, although I liked Tom, I did sometimes resent him walking in over our heads. After all, many of us had more commissioned service than he had before we came to the regiment. Another person who came back to the regiment from the left out of battle camp was Raoul, who had come out on the boat with me, a curious person with interesting antecedents. He fiercely resented Tom's success, as he fiercely resented at least half the circumstances of his life everywhere. He was the son of a British officer and a Frenchwoman, and had been brought up in France on books and no games, at a lycée, until when he was 15, his father being dead, he quarreled with his mother and ran away to sea. He went to South America and back on an oil tanker, and on his return, still not too fluent in English, joined the Royal Tank Corps as a trooper. After 3 years in the British Army, he had learned to speak English and to use, 5 or 6 times in a sentence, the only swear word ever employed by most regular soldiers, and one, incidentally, which must be understood to punctuate most of the direct speech in this account. He had discovered himself to be irresistible to most women. At the outbreak of war, he decided to apply for a commission, which he obtained about 18 months later. In spite of all this experience, he had little idea how to deal either with his superiors or his inferiors, and was the most unpopular officer in the regiment. He foolishly used to run down the yeomanry by comparison with the Royal Tank Corps, in his objectionable, too audible voice. This, combined with his curious origins, accounted for the disapproval of the majority of the officers whose origins and ideas were beautifully standardized. He swore at all the men under him and never remembered, when he was satisfied, to tell them so. This was chiefly a sort of protective, hedgehog attitude acquired because he was, in fact, too shy and sensitive to have run away from a rich home and thrown himself on the world's mercy. He had never found his balance. I had begun by disliking him as much as anyone, but as I began to understand him, having been given the clue to his character by his history, I found him likable and well-meaning. He was now pleased to find me with the regiment again. "You're the only person who'll be glad to see me," he said, characteristically, and added, seeing Tom and Edward pass, "Look at Tom. I suppose he thinks he's second in command of the squadron. Well, if they make him a captain over my head, I'm bloody well going to leave the regiment." I was able to divert him into reminiscence about some girl in Alexandria. I have lumped together these three sketches of people because, when you know something about them, and about the personal situation between us, it will be easier to see how we behaved as we did in and out of action during the next few weeks. Our last evening before going into action again was a busy one. In the morning, a church service was held by the padre. Everyone who could spare the time came and stood round him while he intoned 2 or 3 collects, and hymns were sung to the lugubrious accompaniment of a saxophone. The padre had an ascetic appearance and an accent which owed more to his public school than to his clerical studies. He had a somewhat halting delivery, particularly when reading or quoting. But there was no humbug about him. He was there to give some help, and he persuaded everyone that what he said he believed. As the last unmelodious words of the ragged hymn lost themselves among the metallic noises of preparation, and the priest raised his hand, looking like one of the Brangwyn murals in Christ's Hospital Chapel, to give the blessing, out stepped Piccadilly Jim, occupying the last few moments, though with bowed head, in giving a last twirl to his moustache and regarding his suede boots. The laces of these boots were tied in reef knots, with exactly equal ends hanging symmetrically on each side of the foot, ending at the welt of the boot. "Tomorrow," he said, "we shall go forward to fight the second phase of the Battle of Alamein. The first phase, the dislodgement of the enemy from his position along the whole of his line of battle, is complete. In that phase, this division, this brigade, did sterling work. The divisional general and the brigadier are very pleased." Here he interposed some acknowledgement of the efforts of individuals, somewhat like an author acknowledging indebtedness in a preface, adding, "But you all did your jobs in a way of which you can be proud. In the action at dusk on Tuesday, you stuck to your guns, you didn't give way, and you were extremely successful. When it was possible to investigate the position, it was found that we had knocked out 5 enemy tanks, without casualties to ourselves, and at the price of 1 lorry. That was most excellent. Bloody good. Couldn't be better. Now this time, in the second phase, we shall not have quite so much dirty work to do. Other people are to be allowed to look in. General Montgomery is going to divide the enemy's forces up into small pockets. Tonight, the New Zealanders will attack and, after them, will go the 9th Armoured Brigade and other armoured formations. When General Montgomery is ready, we shall move in behind them, to administer the coup de grace to the German armour. That is a great honour, and you can take credit to yourselves that it has been granted to this brigade. When we've destroyed the enemy's armour and routed his forces, we shall then go back to Cairo, and, have a bath, and leave the other buggers to do the chasing for us." This speech, the first of Piccadilly Jim's resumes I had heard, impressed me without deceiving me. It was couched in a nice mixture of parliamentary and colloquial terms, magnifying what we had done, half belittling what remained to be done, half glorifying it. And it ended with a seductive rumour of leave, which he was certainly not entitled to offer us. It was exactly the right speech, in exactly the right words. It put everyone into a good fighting temper, likely to last them throughout the next week of action. As soon as we had dispersed, the less exhilarating facts crowded upon us. New tanks were due to arrive and must be taken over. The reassembly of the suspension on the tank that had run across some barbed wire was not complete and would have to be completed by night. Every tank had to be filled with food, rations, current and emergency, water, and ammunition. Lorries jolted and lurched slowly round from tank to tank, distributing their wares, one petrol, another oil, another water, and at length, the quartermaster, ready for once to hand out socks, battle dress, greatcoats, without even taking a signature for them, and the ammunition lorry, which threw us out a pile of shells in cardboard cases. We stripped off the cardboard and the safety clips on detonators and filled the racks with bright brass shells, resting on their wasp-colored noses. Flaps had to be torn from the machine gun ammunition tins, and the belts inspected to see they had no rounds loose or projecting. Grenades were to be primed. Inside the squat, angular, sloping turrets, the gunners were busy fitting back the dark blue steel-jacketed machine guns, oiled and spotless, and replacing the great sliding breech blocks of the 6 and 2 pounders, loosening the ammunition in the racks. The operator, crammed in the top of the turret, tested the meters on his set, breathed and hummed into the microphone, listening for side tone, tried a remark to the gunner over the intercommunication. And the driver, busiest of all, at each tank was now outside, tipping in great tins of petrol and oil, wrenching at the fan belts with a spanner, levering and sweating to tighten the tracks, now inside, making the engine roar, watching his gauges. Myself and all the other troop leaders rushed from tank to tank of our troops, then to the squadron leader to report each tank ready to move, to receive final orders, and to draw in, with chinograph pencils on our cellophane map covers, the outline of the New Zealand box, the route of the advance armoured brigade, the known positions of some mines and enemy anti-tank guns. Then this information had to be given out to the troops. At the last hour of twilight, it appeared that the oil lorry had contrived to pass one of my tanks by. I staggered off into the murk and found the fitters, from whom I borrowed a 14-gallon drum. But to carry it back by hand, and search for the right tank among all the indefinite shapes of vehicles, was obviously foolish. I put it down and looked about for a vehicle to do my portage. The only one available was a jeep, to which, at the moment, no one laid claim. In this, carrying the drum of oil, I set off, only to drive almost immediately into a slit trench. This necessitated sweating about to find a 3-tonner or a tank to tow us out. Sending the jeep driver to arrange matters with the fitters, once I had located them again, I went back to explain the delay to Edward. Here I found Andrew beside himself with fury, who rated me violently for not carrying the drum by hand. It appeared he was to navigate the regiment next morning in the jeep. He spoke as if I had lost the jeep on a mine and as if on him, personally, depended the regiment's fate. In fact, our path into action lay along very clearly defined tracks which every man in the regiment had pointed out to him on his platoon commander's map. A child could have found its way into that battle. The same is true of most battles. Andrew's remarks were not quite ridiculous enough not to infuriate me, however, in my harassed state, so I left him to swear at the air and went back to work. In 5 minutes, we had the jeep out of its hole and in a quarter of an hour had delivered the drum and brought the jeep back to Andrew, whom I saluted smartly, omitting, since he would be using it before first light, to tell him about the pool of oil on the passenger's seat. It was now about midnight. We were to move at 4 o'clock, and prepared to get some sleep, since every tank in the squadron was now topped up and fitted with everything down to boiled sweets, condensed milk, and coffee from an opportune mobile canteen. But we were hardly between the blankets before our ears caught the unmistakable rumble of Crusader engines. The new tanks, long despaired of, were arriving. During the next hour came 4 of them. This necessitated a complete revision of the composition of troops and the provision of crews for the new tanks, whose skeleton delivery crews returned to their delivery point. Non-commissioned officers acting as gunners or drivers were promoted to tank commanders. Changing tanks about meant hasty unstrapping of kit, redistribution of rations, particularly the canteen stuff, and a frenzied search for more maps, which had to be marked. All this took place in darkness. The arrival of the new tanks utterly altered the geography of the area. Having grown used to recognizing each tank by its distance from the next and by the direction in which it faced, a man sent from one side of the area to the other in the dark had to contend with the sudden apparition of tanks where none had been before. This caused immense confusion. The wirelesses in the new tanks had to be checked and netted on the regimental frequency. One of the tanks allotted to me had a wireless out of order. A spare part had to be found and fitted. At first, the wireless mechanic shut himself in the turret and worked with the light on, but this was soon forbidden because light streamed out through cracks between the two halves of the turret top. After that, he worked by touch. The new tanks were deficient in ammunition, petrol, oil, water, and internal fittings. They had no Tommy guns in them, no bivouac tents strapped along their sides. Their tracks wanted tightening. Their machine guns were half hidden in a paste of dust and oil, in which they would have to stay, since to strip them in the dark would only result in the loss of all the essential small parts. The delivery of these tanks at this hour and in this state was nothing unusual. It would not be too much to say it was typical. The cause of it, as of most military and civilian confusion, was lack of imagination, this time on the part of the people behind the line, who never troubled to find out what happened a few miles in front of them. As a result of constant journeys to and fro across the area of men laden with burdens of all kinds, From small wireless parts to tins of cheese and bully beef, all 4 new tanks moved with us in the morning at the appointed hour, although not in a condition to inspire their weary crew's confidence. The move up to our battle positions was the usual tedious grind along powdery tracks. Wireless silence was in force. The crews mostly sat bunched in the turrets, smoking, chewing sweets or biscuits, reading when it was light enough, or when an easygoing tank commander would allow the turret lamp to be switched on. The noise of engines prohibited casual conversation. Those who had nothing to read slept uneasily, huddled up like birds. Troop leaders leaned anxiously on their turrets, feeling the last of the night air against their cheeks. The dust caked on everyone's face who looked out of his turret, and on the drivers, on whom so far the greatest strain fell, who drove straining their eyes at the dust clouds, their armored flaps open. Later, a crew's turn comes, and the drivers sit for hours perhaps, over books. The unnatural loudness of our voices over the intercommunication prevents any conversation from being companionable or comforting by this, the only audible, method. There is no knowing what thoughts may come during these approach marches. They are the only moments when it is hard to avoid reveries, and they take place during the last and most depressing hours before dawn. As it grew light, the head of the column swung through half a right angle, and we saw ahead a gap with barbed wire walls, bearing metal triangles attached to the wire, the gap through a minefield. Here we passed, craning our heads in a momentary interest, 3 monstrous tanks, the first Churchill tanks we had ever seen. They were being sent into the battle on test. Unfortunately, whoever arranged these tests, sitting safely behind a cavalry moustache and a desk in GHQ Cairo, had omitted to inform the combatant troops, and one of the 3 was destroyed neatly and ruthlessly by our own anti-tank gunners. For the moment, however, there they were, a sideshow for us to gape at as we swung past and into the minefield. It soon appeared that the attack of the night before had not been entirely successful. We had to deploy for action immediately on emerging from the minefield. We had heard that the plan for the preliminary attack by New Zealanders, Highland troops, and tanks had made provision for 100% casualties, provided that the objectives were taken. It was soon apparent that these casualties had been more easily fulfilled than the condition of taking the objectives. We passed an area of weapon pits where British and Italian corpses lay together. It was not easy to see them through the dust. A tank action was in progress about 400 yards in front and to our right. The regiment wheeled right and halted, with a screen of crusaders in front. In the no-man's land area ahead of us, a Daimler scout car, flying a red cross, was moving and halting, collecting wounded out of holes in the ground. We moved forward, looking across a great plain. Vehicles of some sort could be made out on the horizon, but out of our range. Raoul and his troop were sent still farther out and reported enemy tanks. Presently these tanks advanced, and we all fired at them. I now had a new gunner, called Kerr, having a voice exactly like Moody and hailing also from Glasgow. Unlike Moody, he had a respectable appearance and did not talk much. He seemed to be an inexperienced gunner, and did not do much harm, except with one lucky shot which hit and set on fire one of the enemy. His other shots fell short or plunged over the target. 2 more of the enemy were set on fire, and the others retired. We began to creep forward, swinging west again to face the enemy. As we advanced, I remembered how we had sat so long during my first action within a stone's throw of enemy infantry, and I began to look very carefully at the trenches we passed. About 200 yards from the German derelicts, which were now furiously belching inky smoke, I looked down into the face of a man lying hunched up in a pit. His expression of agony seemed so acute and urgent, his stare so wild and despairing, that for a moment I thought him alive. He was like a cleverly posed waxwork, for his position suggested a paroxysm, an orgasm of pain. He seemed to move and writhe. But he was stiff. The dust that powdered his face like an actor's lay on his wide-open eyes, whose stare held my gaze like the ancient mariner's. He had tried to cover his wounds with towels against the flies. His haversack lay open, from which he had taken towels and dressings. His water bottle lay tilted, with the cork out. Towels and haversack were dark with dried blood, darker still with a great concourse of flies. This picture, as they say, told a story. It filled me with useless pity. As the tank went gruffly past, the head of a living man was raised from the next pit. He had not the strength to keep it raised but lifted head and arm alternately, as a man lifts a hat on a stick to draw fire. As we went on moving past, an awful despair settled on his face. I halted the tank, realizing suddenly that the driver had not seen him, and had the engine switched off. I got out of the turret and ran to him, hoping there were no snipers about. I held a 2-gallon water can for him while he drank the warm, Rusty water. Then he said, "Can you get me out of here?" He was a second lieutenant, I think of New Zealand infantry. His leg was hit in several places below the knee and covered, like the dead man's wound, with a towel. "The one that got me got my water bottle," he said. "I've been here 2 days. I've had about enough. Can you get me out?" His voice broke and hesitated over the words. He suddenly added, remembering, "Do something for the chap in the next trench," and, seeing my face, "Is he dead?" "Dead as a doornail," said my voice. The words blundered out without any intention. God knows what made me say them. I had meant only to nod. I saw him wince and felt dumb with embarrassment. "He was hit the same time," he said. 3 Jerry tanks came almost up to us, firing at you, I suppose. Your stuff was landing all round here." I went back to the tank, not quite sure if Piccadilly Jim would allow this diversion, and asked permission to take a wounded man back to a regimental aid post on the tank. In my fear of a refusal, I made my request too long-winded, so that Piccadilly Jim replied, "Yes, yes, 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 yes. But for Christ's sake get off the air. I'm trying to fight a battle." Off. I went back to the trench and said, "Could you manage to get on the back of the tank if we help you?" I began to feel ashamed of having the protection of a tank for myself. "I can manage anything to get out of this bloody pit," he said, and we hauled him up onto the hot steel plates above the engine, while he clenched his teeth and shut his eyes but made no complaint. Our long hesitation at this spot had been remarked by the crew of an enemy mortar somewhere, which began to lob shells in our wake as we moved back, luckily quite inaccurately. We dumped the wounded subaltern and his kit and equipment, about which he was very anxious, among a guard set over some prisoners, who were already giving him hot tea as we skidded round to face the enemy. We had hardly rejoined the squadron when the whole regiment moved back to refuel in the area where we had deployed in the morning. A desultory high-explosive fire made the refueling an uncomfortable time. The squadron officers held a sort of hasty conference in the lee of Edward's tank, ducking solemnly behind it at each ominous whistle, and waiting silently for the shell burst as a sort of permission for whoever was speaking to complete his sentence. To us, non-commissioned officers came saluting, out of habit rather than from any punctilious instinct, and reporting the usual defects already acquired in spite of all the maintenance of the last few days. Few Crusader tanks would run for more than 2 days in action without developing either an oil leak or a water leak. 2 tanks, one of mine and one of Raoul's, now had oil leaks, which would mean they're going back to light aid detachment workshops, now established at the mouth of the minefield. I was to go back to light aid detachment in charge of these 2 tanks, Raoul having demanded permission to stay in action. Tom came across and joined the group, puffing at his foul old pipe. "Some bastard of a sniper got poor little Bingham and Corporal Wood," he said. Edward said, "I'm very sorry, but having to think in terms of tanks," asked, "Was the tank damaged?" "No, he just plugged one of them while he was looking out of the turret, and I suppose the other one looked out to see what it was and he got it in the neck too. I'd like to catch the sod that did it. Poor little Bingham. One of the best little operators in the squadron." I was ordered to take over the tank of these unfortunates, which had been driven back to light aid detachment and was waiting there. Late in the afternoon, we arrived back at light aid detachment, where, as we halted, the tall ordnance officer whom I had first seen on my arrival at the regiment on boat track approached, saying, "Just disperse a bit, will you, old boy? We've only got thin skins here, you know, and they've chucked quite a bit of stuff at us already." "What's the trouble?" "Oil leaks, these 2. Have you got a sound Crusader here? One that had a couple of chaps sniped in it?" He hesitated. "It's okay," he said. "But the turret's in a bit of a mess." I was afraid it would be, but obviously, we would have to make the best of that. As we walked over to find it, the light aid detachment officer shouted after me, "I say, if you're taking that tank, will you put your own driver on it? The other chap's a bit shaken up, and I think he could do with a rest." We found the tank. Its driver was leaning against it, eating meat and vegetables out of a tin. His mug stood on the front of the tank. He did not appear very shaken, a young North countryman, stocky built, with a square red face and tow-colored hair. "I didn't seem to be getting any orders, like, sir," he said, in explanation, so I had a look at George, Corporal Wood. He was sitting in his seat, and at first I thought he were all right. But then I see he were dead. Then I had a look at Bert, like, and he were all over blood, so I come out of it guilty. The inside of the turret confirmed his story. The breech of the 6-pounder and its deflector bag, the wireless, the machine gun, and the shells in the racks were splashed thickly with blood. A bloody belt hung from the machine gun, the empty cases of some shells lay in an inch-deep pool of blood on the floor. It would not have required much imagination to see a steam of blood rising. "Bit mucky in the turret," said the driver, as though apologizing to an inspecting officer, when I climbed down. There was not much daylight left, and I got permission over the air to stay out of battle for the night and come back in the morning. The night was cold and noisy. I scraped myself a shallow trench beside the tank and slept in it wearing all my clothes and my British warm, rolled in my blankets and the remains of an Arab coat of lamb's wool. My tummy was full of hot tea and tinned maconochie. For some time, I was worried by irregular whistling of projectiles overhead from some British gun, and lay watching the usual parabola of machine gun bullets climbing towards Orion and falling away. This night, like every night of that battle, was one of clear starlight. At length, reassured by the stars, and generating warmth inside my wrappings, I slept. In the morning, we spent a little time cleaning up the guns and ammunition of the tank we had taken over, and switching on the wireless, could hear the conversation of the regiment moving up into battle positions from its harbor. When all the kit was transferred from our old tank, we set off between 9 and 10 o'clock to rejoin the regiment. The bodies of some Italian infantrymen still lay in their weapon pits, surrounded by pitiable rubbish, picture postcards of Milan, Rome, Venice, snapshots of their families, chocolate wrappings, and hundreds of cheap cardboard cigarette packets. Among this litter, more suggestive of holidaymakers than soldiers, there were here and there bayonets and the little tin red devil grenades, bombastic little crackers that will blow a man's hand off and make a noise like the crack of doom. But even these, associated with the rest of the rubbish, looked only like cutlery and cruets. The Italians lay about like trippers taken ill. The plumed helmets of the Bersaglieri were everywhere, fluttering in the breeze of early morning. Many of the plumes had already been torn off to decorate the petrol lorries and ration trucks. On the air, I heard Raoul's voice reporting the position of an 88mm gun, Edward adjuring him to be careful. A few minutes later, Raoul's jubilant report of the gun's capture, the colonel's congratulations, closely followed by the artillery observation post's voice announcing more 88mm positions. Edward's message, nuts 3, be careful. Don't go swanning over that ridge, was not acknowledged. By now, we were moving about in rear of the brigade, trying to find out which flank the regiment was holding, and soon we discovered the colonel's tank and the heavy squadrons, while about a mile away could be seen the Crusaders crawling about on a ridge, where already the burnt-out remains of some other regiment's Shermans lay where the German guns had caught them the day before. Moving across toward the heavy tanks, we passed the body of a Highland infantryman, whose legs, with their red hackles, were doubled under him, broken at the knee. I afterwards heard that he was found to have been attached by the Italians to a bursting charge, which the Royal Engineers neutralized. This was typical of the behavior of the little beasts, who combined underhand cruelty with cowardice and servility when we caught up with them. The Italian attitude of "we never wanted to fight" was true enough, with its corollary, "we only wanted to tie bombs to wine bottles and corpses, and leave them for you to find." I reported to the colonel and moved out to join Edward. I was beginning to have trouble with my trousers, an outsized pair of issue battle dress, which I had hastily confined under a belt. They began to escape the belt and slip down. As fast as I pulled up one side, the other descended. In despair, I undid them and put them on again from the beginning. This activity was too much for the two remaining fly buttons, which came off. We used to think it typical of military methods that battle dress trousers are supplied with sharp tin buttons that begin cutting themselves off as soon as they are sewn on. I met Edward's tank coming back past two burnt-out Italian M13 tanks, whose crews were neatly laid in two charred rows beside them. For some reason, the feet and boots had nearly all escaped the flames. I dismounted and went across to Edward to get some verbal instructions and save nattering on the air. "Raoul's been hit," he said. "The tank brewed up and his driver's killed. Ken Tinker's bringing him in. He is a bloody fool, he would go over that ridge. Go on up to somewhere where you can see, will you, and take charge of the squadron till I come back." I went up as far as I could and stayed watching the 88mm guns that were firing across my front. I heard the colonel ask the Royal Horse Artillery to get onto a suspicious object on the ridge, but did not realize until the ranging shells arrived that I was the suspicious object. I retreated, protesting over the wireless, and soon afterwards the colonel's tank moved up near me and he beckoned me to dismount and come across to him. I tumbled out of the turret, forgetting the state of my trousers, which immediately fell round my ankles. I hauled them up with one hand and staggered across to him. When I had told him all I knew, I hobbled back and climbed onto my tank in time to hear Ken Tinker reporting the destruction of the last 88mm gun. In the afternoon, we moved right-handed to the north and tried to drive the enemy gunners from a track, visible on the skyline by the tops of its telegraph poles. During the afternoon, my wireless set gave out, and breakdowns among the remaining tanks reduced the Crusader squadron to 3 tanks, with 1 wireless between them. Edward, in the tank with the wireless, with Tom as his gunner, lay low in a gully about 1,000 yards from the 88mm guns on the track. His gears were not working well, and he did not want to move more than necessary. Away to the left, a sergeant in the other dumb tank stayed put, hull down, observing. By shouting directions to my driver above the noise of the engine, internal communication having broken down with the wireless, I was able to move my tank, using dips in the ground, to within about 660 yards of the telegraph poles, and saw that 2 or 3 Mark III tanks were in support of the guns. When I had seen as much as I could, I turned my tank and moved back into Edward's little wadi, where I dismounted and ran across to his tank. I made 2 of these journeys, and Edward passed back my news to the regiment over the air. Each time I dismounted, I still skidded about on the metal of the tank, the soles of my boots being covered with half-congealed blood from the pool in the bottom of the turret. Flies hung above the tank in a cloud. Toward the end of the afternoon, smoke projectiles, spluttering smoke along the whole arc of their flight, began to come from the direction of the telegraph wires. We had still moved no nearer and were more or less pinned. We all looked expectantly and apprehensively at the smoke, expecting an attack of tanks or infantry. But none came. This was our first experience of one of the enemy's favorite tricks. The smoke cleared away. Some of our heavy tanks began to lumber closer to the Crusaders, like clumsy yokel spectators. They immediately came under heavy fire from the 88mm guns, which ranged on them with grey bursts of high explosive, and a few ear-splitting airbursts to keep the crew's heads down. I looked across at Edward and Tom, who were peering anxiously over the tip of our little depression, pipes clamped in their mouths, puffing out sharp spurts of smoke through their lips as though they were opening fire. Presently, the chuckling noises in the air announced that the 88mm guns had got their range and were loading with armor-piercing shot. 3 of the big tanks were hit almost simultaneously, and the aviation petrol in them went up with a whoosh. Out of the turrets tumbled their crews, pursued by volcanic tongues of flame and billows of black smoke. The crew of one of them huddled together, supporting each other like revelers going home. The shells flew over, one after another. Glancing over the side of my tank, I saw a magazine, oil-stained and torn, but with a familiar cover. It was a copy of Esquire. The Crusaders had not moved and remained turret down, unnoticed by the enemy gunners. I decided to get out, and did so, landing full upon the magazine as another round rocketed overhead, and adding a bloody footprint to the stains of oil and wet sand. In the turret, the gunner and I turned the pages, and admired, with as much attention as we could, the pink petty girl, telephoning from her cushions, and a full page of color photography, depicting various Hollywood personalities dining and dancing at some club or other. Beneath the oil stains, their white tuxedos and seductive dresses shone, and they flashed their red lips and white teeth at the photographer. As we turned the page on a Peter Arno Rouet, the 25-pounders began to reply, and Piccadilly Jim's voice sounded in the earphones, addressing the heavy tanks, which had begun to move back in the face of a murderous fire. Nobody told you to retire. Get back. Bloody well get back and give the buggers hell. You're bloody sticky. The tanks stopped edging away and came up into their positions. The 25-pounders found the range, and the enemy gunners began to limber up and get away soon afterwards, leaving 2 guns and their crews behind, destroyed. We saw no more of their tanks, and soon after this, I was sent back to refuel. The petrol lorries had arrived beside a derelict 1,500-weight truck, the driver of which lay half in, half out of it, with one leg almost entirely torn off. The battle-dress serge had peeled away, showing a wreckage of flesh and the ends of bones. We moved some little distance away from this site and began to bang petrol tins about, tearing them out of their wooden outer cases and bashing holes in them with an Italian bayonet. As soon as we had finished filling up the tank, we got a brew on, of coffee and meat and vegetables, and as we were about to decant the silty coffee into mugs and mess tins, heard another tank coming. We looked up casually enough, since the engine note was that of a Sherman, and we were not much interested in the other squadrons. What we saw was an odd sight. It was a Sherman, right enough, but as it came towards us in the beginning of twilight, a red aureole about the turret top proclaimed that the inside was blazing. The immediate effect was of something supernatural, as though the dead or mangled crew were bringing in the remains of their tank. A very slim connection reminded me momentarily of Ambrose Bierce's Horseman in the Sky. The tank stopped about 100 yards off, as I finished my coffee, and a figure emerged from the driver's manhole and came a little unsteadily toward our fire. It was Nick, a lieutenant out of C Squadron, whom I had only once met before, at division when he was sent up there on a liaison job. His pleasant face was as black as a Christie minstrel's and lit up into a nigger smile as he said, "Hello, old boy, I've just brought my Sherman in. I wonder if you'd mind giving a hand to put the fire out?" And sniffing, I say, "Is that coffee?" We poured him out what was left and went round to collect fire extinguishers from the 2 petrol lorries. Armed with these, and our own, we approached the burning tank, a little gingerly perhaps, since we knew there were 30 or 40 high explosive shells and thousands of bullets inside the burning turret, enough to blow the whole tank to pieces and fill the air with random pieces of metal for 20 minutes afterwards, as the ammunition in the belts went off. We began by pouring all the water in the tank's water cans into the turret. The fire within retaliated with a frightful hissing, and sparks flew up among a fog of steam and oily smoke. But the fire was undiscouraged. It had now spread to the driver's seat in spite of this. The tank engine had continued running for the 2 miles or so necessary to bring it in, one of those things that happen, but of which no one demands an explanation. The fire extinguishers had more effect, and the fire died down to a smoking mass. We had untied the kit bags from the kit rail on the outside of the tank and carried them and the blankets to a safe distance, where they were piled. We were not disposed to waste any more of our water, and all the extinguishers were squirted dry, so we climbed down off the hot shell of the tank and went back for another brew of coffee. Twilight was now deepening into darkness, and the skyline where the battle had taken place was punctuated with the gleam of 3 of our Shermans, still blazing merrily. We heard, through the earphones dangling on the side of the tank, the regiment receiving orders to move back into Liga. "Lot of muck and good it was our trying to put that out," said someone. The red glow was visible again in the turret of Nick's tank. Among all these beacons, we thought our small brew fire might be allowed to break the rule against fires after dark. The enemy were at least 4 miles off, anyway, and no one fires at a solitary campfire, except with small arms. But the medical officer, very agitated, arrived in a scout car and remonstrated with us. As the second brew of coffee was ready, we gave in to him and put the fire out, further stopping his mouth with a cup of the coffee. That night, we were issued with about a couple of wine glasses full of rum to each man, the effect of which was a little spoiled by one of our 25-pounders, which was off calibration and dropped shells in the middle of our area at regular intervals of seconds for about an hour. The first shells made a hole in the adjutant's head and blinded a corporal in B Squadron. I spent an uncomfortable night curled up on a bed of tacky blood on the turret floor. That concludes the 3rd part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.